My name is Jack Tang. I'll be presenting our work on tamper-resistant, pin-constrained digital microfluidic biochips. This is work that we recently presented at the Design Automation Conference last June, in collaboration with Krish and Mohammed at Duke University and with my advisor, Ramesh Kari. So before we get started, one thing I just want to talk about, what are we doing here, right? We're talking about hardware security and trust in microfluidics, but what does this mean? A lot of times when we've submitted work to various conferences and journals, they're like, how is this any different from what we've been doing for the last 10, 20 years? Things with computer hardware security, IoT security, or just general reliability engineering. So I just wanted to take a minute to outline, a few points that I think can address this question, in case you're wondering. One is it requires extensive domain knowledge. It's very highly interdisciplinary. You know things about biochemistry, material science. The implications and interpretations of the results are quite heightened due to mission-critical applications. So this is kind of both a plus and a minus. Like, if you're doing something like intrusion detection, like interpreting some probability, like we have like 1% probability that we're going to be susceptible to an attack. Like, how do you interpret that? That's probably not going to be good enough. Whereas if you're doing something for like network intrusion detection, you might be able to get away with it. Reliability engineering, it's derived from realistic fault models, realistic failure models. You get data on an actual thing you fabricate or experimental data, and then you try to match your engineering towards that. Attacks are much more arbitrary. They're very difficult to defend against because your adversary is a human and they can be very ingenious and clever. And the last thing I want to mention is that how I see microfluidic security is that there should be a focus on low-level hardware design. And this is important because these biochips, they're integrated with a lot of electronics, and we have like this huge body of work for secure devices. We're not trying to throw all that away, right? This is all in service to augment or complement the capabilities that we already have. And I think of this as kind of like the last line of defense, right? So we're trying to think about ways we can design hardware that is intrinsically secure, which I think Professor Densmore remarked on in his talk. And this is going to be the focus of my talk here. So I think if you are following the program, the title of the talk was just Security and Trust in Microfluidics, which was a very general, broad topic. I decided at the last minute to really narrow our focus down on one particular technology and one particular countermeasure that I developed as part of my PhD thesis work, as a bet that all the stuff that came before was going to cover all the background that we needed. And I think I made a good bet because we had a lot of good talks prior to this. So the problem I want to tackle is this idea of actuation tampering. So this is just defined as the modification of the control signals that are used to drive a microfluidic biochip. So you have this biochip. At the end of the day, you're just trying to send signals to this thing to move fluids around. You can get those signals from various ways, but if you're talking about someone who's trying to maliciously alter the way this biochip functions, they have to actually do something with these control signals. So this is very broad. It encompasses a wide variety of outcomes, threat models, attack surfaces, physical modalities, and because of this I think this is a good target for research because it covers so much ground. And the question is, as hardware designers, can we make it harder for an attacker to achieve their goals when we're doing the hardware design phase? So here I have this picture, this kind of very generic benchtop microfluidic platform. Inside, there's going to be your actual biochip that does the manipulation. There's a series of actuators. There's probably an embedded PC, some user interface, and then there's also going to typically be some type of network or external interface, which is going to be a potent attack surface for someone to come in and try to take advantage of your system. And again, this is another view of the generic benchtop microfluidic platform. And in other cases, you may also have some external connection to a computer to do more advanced processing. This is a pretty accurate representation, I think, given all the offerings that are out there. So we have some people here who are from Fluidigm, Babies, give talk previously. Lumina NeoPrep is a discontinued benchtop platform that's related to Babies. There's some newer stuff from Oxford. And then there's also some interesting open source projects that you can look at if you want to build these devices yourself, like the Orn Open Drop, and then this is from the Wheeler Lab, the Cybots Dropbot. So we're going to focus on digital microfluidics, and it's great that we had the talk from Babies earlier, so I don't have to get too deep into how it works. So I'm going to assume you remember what digital microfluidics is and how electrowetting on dielectric works. What I want to get into, though, is more of the details of how that works. So if you consider like a general purpose digital microfluidic biochip, it's just like a regular grid of patterned electrodes, which is a little different from the ones we saw earlier where it was application specific, where you had like these channels etched out on the PCB. Here we're going to consider designs that are a little more general purpose. And those control signals that we use to drive this biochip, it was mentioned before that it's just turning on and off electrical signals, which is true, but this is very tedious in practice, right? So what you want to do is you want to have some type of way to automate this process. So a lot of work has been done that was pioneered at UC Riverside and Duke to automate this workflow. And typically what you do is you specify your sequencing graph, and then you have like a module library of all the resources that are available on chip and what it is capable of doing. You go through this architectural synthesis phase where you schedule the operations, you bind the resources, and then you feed it to the next stage, which is a physical level synthesis, where all these virtual operations are mapped to the biochip. And then you route the droplets to where they need to be so that they can execute the operations on time. Okay, so then this is an automated design flow, which is, I think, critical to having a practical, realizable digital microfluidic platform. So when we're talking about actuation tampering, it's like we're taking the output of this thing, and we're trying to, an attacker could possibly go in and figure out what operations you're doing by reverse engineering, because usually there's a one-to-one mapping between the droplets and the pattern of actuations. And they can try to manipulate your test results or cause a denial service attack. So they're really just tampering with these actuations. Now, the solution that I propose is this concept of a tamper-resistant DMFB. And so I'm going to throw some words at you. We're going to get into more detail in the subsequent slides. But real quickly, tamper resistance of a pin-constrained DMFB is based on the number of distribution of don't cares due to a pin mapping operation. Okay, so I apologize. There's actually quite a lot of background we have to get into before this thing is going to make sense. So just please bear with me. So in a DMFB, there's this concept of a direct addressed versus a pin mapped addressing scheme. Okay, so again, this is also mentioned in the Babies talk, is that you have all these electrodes, and you can actually group some of them together to send them the same electrical signals as a way to save pin count. Otherwise, you'd have to do a direct correspondence between each electrode and then the driving signal, which could really balloon to the thousands or more and make it impractical for implementation. So using this concept of a pin map DFB, you group them together, use some algorithm to figure out how you can do this, and then you send them the same signal. And when you do this, you actually restrict the degrees of freedom for the droplet movements, right? You can't just arbitrarily move droplets around. And what we're going to do is we're going to take advantage of this as a way to secure our device, right? We're going to make it so that you can't just do any arbitrary operation. And if you do, we're going to make it so that's easy for us to catch you. So here there's this relationship, inherent relationship between reconfigurability and security, which is interesting because in a lot of the security literature, this is like kind of a recurring theme that we come across a lot. Okay, so broadcast addressing. This figure should give you a good understanding of how it works. So imagine you have 5 electrodes. This is just a dummy actuation sequence where we have pin activations and deactivations, and we also have these don't cares. So don't care is an electrode that isn't actively involved in the manipulation of a droplet. You have a 1 where you want to hold the droplet, and you have a 0 where you want to hold the region around the droplet so that no other droplets interfere with it. Based on these actuation sequences, you can represent it as a compatibility graph. Each node represents an electrode. You draw a line between them if you can actually merge those two electrodes together. And by compatibility, we mean, a 1 can be merged with another 1, a 0 can be merged with another 0, but not 1 with a 0, and then don't care, obviously, we don't care about. So when you do that operation, you get this collapsed actuation sequence where you only have 2 pins. You can send the same sequence to all those electrodes, and they can all be tied together. All right. Now, in the process of doing so, we have this thing that's called a redundant unit. And a redundant unit is basically a don't care that's masked by a 1 or a 0. So we're going to call these redundant activation units and redundant deactivation units respectively. These have implications for power and reliability that has been explored extensively in the past, because if you have an activation where you don't need one, then you're expending energy, and also you're degrading the electrode lifetime. Okay? So so we're going to get to a picture, which hopefully make this clear in a second. And then the threat model we're considering in this attack is that this is going to be a remote party. They're able to read, modify, reverse engineer actuation sequences, and they want to remain stealthy. So something like a denial service is actually a little bit beyond the scope here. But we're thinking of things like where someone wants to go in and maliciously alter your sample that's under test. And the defender is us as the DMFB platform designer. Okay. So an attacker wants to do these bad things. In practice, they're going to be limited by some things, such as maybe we know just approximately how long the assay should execute, so you can't do something that's like arbitrarily long. There may be some error recovery system in place. We may have implemented intrusion detection if we're already thinking about security. And maybe the reverse engineering capabilities are hampered by some type of obfuscation layer. So there's a lot of things that actually make it hard for an attacker to do whatever they want. But one thing that we want to focus on is the pin mapping, okay? So here we have a snapshot of a biochip that's executing an in vitro 4x4 diagnostic assay. So we have various operations going on at the chip at once. We have like 3 or rather 5 detection operations. 2 droplets are being actively mixed. We have 2 droplets that are being stored. And let's imagine that we're an attacker and we want to just route an extra plasma droplet just to dilute a sample. And then in the course of doing so, they have to activate these electrodes in the path of this red droplet. They're highlighted in yellow. But due to the broadcast addressing scheme, remember, we are now sending the same activation to multiple electrodes. So in the course of doing this attack, we actually activate all these other yellow electrodes at the same time. Now, most of them don't do anything. But we notice here in this mix 29 operation, it actually interferes with that droplet in the mix operation. So you actually can get inadvertent splitting. Now, here in this case, because of this broadcast addressing scheme, we can see very clearly that by doing this broadcast addressing, arbitrary operations may actually cascade and do other unintended things that can make the attack predictable. Or not predictable, but detectable. And we're going to try to leverage this phenomenon in pin mapping. So the idea, again, is masking the don't cares is good for security, right? Because we have previously had all these don't cares, and now if we just mask them, then hopefully we're going to get some cascaded effects. And we're going to introduce a security metric, which I call the redundant unit coverage, which is basically just the ratio of masked don't cares to total don't cares. And then I also introduce another thing called a proximity coverage class, which is just basically the same thing, but focusing around electrodes that are actually actively being used in the assay in order to focus our attention on droplets that actually matter. Okay. So, tamper-resistant pin mapping. We're going to build a new pin mapper to try to increase these security metrics here, this redundant unit coverage. And then we need to introduce another concept. This is called compatibility degree. So when you merge 2 electrode activation sequences, there's actually 3 different scenarios that can happen. In case 1, all the don't cares overlap, which is a bad thing, because now it's open to tampering, right? If you don't care, then they can make arbitrary changes to it, and we're not looking at it. In the second case is partial overlap. Here we see we only have 1 don't care that's open to tampering, and then in the third case there's no overlap, which is going to be the best case for us, because if you want to make an arbitrary change here, you're going to interfere with the functional droplets. So this problem here can be represented as a graph clustering problem. So like before, we represent electrodes as nodes, compatibility are the edges between nodes, but now we're going to weight the graph based on this idea of compatibility degree, right? So here we can count the number of redundant units, and we're going to use that as our weighting. And this is an NP-hard problem, so of course we're going to try to solve this by proposing a heuristic. Here we came up with a very simple one, which I can explain to you in 4 slides. There's some more housekeeping things that we need to do, so you can refer to the full paper for this, but here it goes. So we have our compatibility graph. We just make an initial guess for the number of pins we want to form. We greedily group the highest weight that's next to that electrode. So we have these initial pins here, and at each iteration, we just go through each pin and try to just grab the most compatible pin and put it in that pin. Sorry, the most compatible electrode and put it in the current pin. So here we start out at the initialization phase. One iteration, we grab for the red pin the highest weight, which is 6, which goes to E6. Next iteration, we go to the blue pin, we greedily grab E2, finish up by grabbing E1, and then we're done. So we performed this tamper-resistant pin mapping operation, implemented it, and tested it on 4 different assays. We used the UC Riverside static simulation tool quite extensively for these simulations. And we can see here, if we're targeting the redundant unit coverage, which was our optimization goal, we see here in yellow that we do actually achieve the optimization, and we get much higher coverage than any of the other existing pin mappers, which includes the original broadcast one and others that are targeted for more reliability. And it's about 39.6 higher percentage coverage than the next best one, which is the broadcast pin mapper. There is some trade-off, though. We do have to increase the pin count in some instances for different assays, like in protein split 5 in vitro 4x4 in particular, and also that there's going to be an increase in switching toggles, which is going to negatively affect your reliability and power consumption. So we can actually go a step further than that. So you may be wondering, okay, great, you increased the redundant usage coverage. It looks like it's about 60%, but like what good does that do for me, right? Why isn't it 100%? And the reason is because sparse actuation sequences make it impossible to have high coverage. And the sparseness of this depends a lot on how you've scheduled your actuation sequence, placement, routing phases. And the only way to really get around this is to, you could change these 3 phases, but you can also try to pack more operations, more droplets in there to make it more dense, make it less sparse. So what we can do is we can boost tamper resistance by inserting these things that are called indicator droplets. And their job is to just do nothing, but just move around the chip so that if someone comes in and attacks, that they're going to do something that we can detect, like move somewhere that is not expected or split off and maybe interfere with another droplet. So we can do this through our good friend integer linear programming, which is quite popular in the EDA community. We have in the paper quite extensive ILP model, but here I'm just going to talk about the simplified version. So we're going to modify the actuation sequence by inserting these droplets, try to increase this coverage concept, and we're going to do this through this simple model here. So the objective here function is just this delta, which is just the placement of a droplet at a specific place and a specific time. It's going to be weighted by a weighting vector, which you do by just, you sample, you place these, do a test droplet, and you see what the effect of it is, and you can calculate that and do a static weight vector. We want to have 3 simple constraints. You got to make sure that it's valid, that is, it doesn't interfere with any other droplets, that you're only going to place 1 indicator droplet at a time, and that there's continuity so that you don't have droplets just disappearing and reappearing at random on the biochip. And then in certain assays, this is still not quite enough. So what you can do is you can do this thing called the sliding window algorithm, which is basically you break it up into small chunks and solve the indicator droplet routing problem, and then append it to the final solution. So this is kind of similar to things you might do in signal processing. And this trades off global optimality for speed. And I'll note it is kind of similar to also to like receding horizon control, but here we don't really care about things like convergence, or because we're just making a best effort to place these indicator droplets, so it just proceeds quite mechanically. And then you can just iterate through this, so you can just keep adding indicator droplets until you get a satisfactory level of tamper resistance. Okay, so I want to introduce another metric here because this redundant usage coverage is a little abstract. So here, I'm going to introduce this concept of probability of detection, and it's just basically a Monte Carlo analysis. So what we're going to do is we're going to simulate a bunch of random attacks, a bunch of tampering attacks on the biochip actuation sequence. We're going to choose, here in this case, 1,000 random attacks. We're going to limit the random walk to 10 steps, and we're going to see what happens. And we have a bunch of data here, so I'll just quickly summarize. We have 4 different assays in the columns, and the probability of detection here is in the bottom row. And we can see here that the tamper-resistant pin mapper has the highest probability of detection out of all of them right off the bat with 0 indicator droplets. As you add indicator droplets, you get closer and closer to the ideal probability of detection, which is 100%. And then also interesting to note is that as you add indicator droplets, the performance gap closes, although in many cases that the tamper-resistant pin mapper still outperforms the others. And then you can get very high probability of detection, approaching the ideal case, especially in like the protein assay here. Even after just 1 indicator droplet, you can get pretty much all attacks detected. So just in conclusion, this is a very simple methodology that alters the distribution of don't cares, such that we increase masking effects and make tampering attacks more difficult for an attacker. And this is great because this is like a low-level design. This is done at the low-level design phase, and pin mapping is basically free, right? If you consider in the design phase and say that you want to do it, you can just do it and get it for free. It's hardware-based. You can't bypass it. It's intrinsic to the way the biochip works. And again, this is to augment and complement the higher levels of security that are implemented in the system. So I imagine you still want to have encryption and all that good stuff operating on your software layer stacks. But in case all that fails, because this is like a very difficult world to secure, we have this hardware-based defense mechanism in place. And of course, there are all these trade-offs: reliability, power cost, and reconfigurability. But these are all quantifiable, as we've seen here, and I think in many cases the trade-offs are quite modest for the security that you get.
Thank you. All right, so questions? Discussion? So Jack, I think your work opens up the possibility of quantifying security. Do you have any thoughts on metrics?
Metrics.
So this, you have all those
yes.
that you're saying it's secure, but how do we quantify that? Is there a metric that you can?
Right. So I think, actually, this probability of detection, this actually was introduced at the last minute. I didn't think of it. I was just more interested in like all the optimization and like counting things, but I think at the end of the day, what you want is something like this, right? Where you can't tell what an attacker is going to do. It's impossible to guess. So I think the best thing you can do is just randomize it, and see just like on average how many of those succeed and how many of those fail.
So there could be a kind of like when Baby sells a platform, they could provide to the customer guarantees that every platform is secure, and this is a quantification of that, and they can charge for that.
I think that'd probably be a very poor marketing move. I mean, that also from a liability perspective. I mean, this also goes back to Security 101, which I remember. Shout out to Locke. I remember I took security with him. He says, security is risk management, right?
Yeah, we know it's not to keep it below the
Yeah. So.
Yeah, I have one question. So you divide it into PCR assay or protein assay, but I mean it seems like to get to the core of it, it's really a question of the droplet operations that occur for each of those.
Mm-hmm.
So one type of assay more droplet operations than another. So would it, instead of categorizing it, because it doesn't tell me anything like, say, PCR versus protein, what's underlying that is the number of droplet operations or the type of droplet complexity.
That's true, right.
That's assessing that. So I wonder if there's a way to capture that metric. It's not just number of droplet operations like we were saying, it's the complexity of those. You know, if you have more.
Right, I see, yes. So, right, it might have been like if we had a plot of assay complexity for whatever metric we chose to use for that versus security.
Combine the number of reagents and the number of droplet operations into some scalar.
Yeah.
That would represent the complexity as a categorical.
Right. I mean, it's like, I mean, we know what the two opposite extremes of that are, right? You have the completely general purpose biochip. You get zero security. You have completely application specific. An attacker can't do anything with it, so you get full security. It's just this nebulous area in between, you know, how we're going to quantify that.
So what are the, you said you did some articles with this, what kinds of attacks, what these are random things?
I mean, we just placed a droplet on the chip and it's random walk. It's a random walk. JV.
Yes, how much physical resource does an attacker need to do these attacks?
Physical resource?
Yeah, like if we look at the semiconductor, some of the semiconductor attacks like reverse engineering, that takes a lot of resource. But they're just doing a simple sidechain analysis, like power sidechain analysis. You just need an equipment that is like around $1,000, $2,000 worth.
Right, but for what kind of attack are you, for like reverse engineering? Oh, I mean, because the complexity of these compared to VLSI is so much lower, it's consequently lower. So
you're saying it's much more practical than some of the VLSI?
Yeah, I mean, I could, if I really wanted to, I could just sit down with a pen and paper and figure out how to attack. You know, I don't need to write a program to do it. It's like granted, this situation can change, right? You know, this technology is a moving target. It's going to get more complex and higher throughput. But, you know, compared to VLSI, it's like orders of magnitude easier.
How long should the video be to get this thing, right?
What's that?
I think you can just monitor the
Yeah, you can, I mean, right there, I think there was some paper where it was just some video-based analysis and they just extract it using pattern recognition algorithms and then just automate the reverse engineering flow.
Okay, so thanks a lot, Jeff.
All right, thank you.